Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to Amsterdam. My name is Timon Diaz and I'm an editor for Geen Stijl, which is the largest Dutch weblog in the world, really. I'm quite overjoyed today because today we are joined by Dr. World Famous Mr. Jordan Peterson. He's a Canadian, but that's hardly all. He is also a professor in clinical psychology at Toronto University, and he's best known for his stance against postmodernism, identity politics, and as an advocate for free speech. Mr. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to see you. Thanks for the invite.
No problem, man, no problem. Pleasure's all ours. Our main theme today will be to discuss your philosophy on how to be in the world properly as an individual. I've watched your lectures on personality transformations, maps of meaning, and the biblical series, and I think I've distilled your philosophy down to what I think are your 5 strongest points. Later on, I will present those points, and we'll unpack them and comment on them.
Yep.
But first, the talk of the day, man. Your interview with Channel 4, Cathy Newman. It started. I was watching this, and it was like a self-propelled train wreck. Just for half an hour, it just kept on going. It was quite fun. The memes that came out of it were really good. But I think yesterday or today, it took kind of a more joyless turn. But first, I want to ask you. We'll talk about the aftermath after. But first, how did you experience that interview? What happened there? What was going on there?
Well, there were lots of things going on, which is why people are watching it, right? I mean, there are lots of things going on at many levels of analysis all the time. And it's hard to determine which level of analysis you should focus on, especially when something complicated is happening. The way I experienced it was that I went into the Channel 4 studio and I sat and well, first in the green room where everything was quite friendly. Cathy was being made up in there, and so we had a pleasant interchange, I would say. And then I was brought into a room where the interview took place with the cameras, and we spoke for 2 or 3 minutes before the cameras rolled, and she was pleasant and engaging, distracted a bit, but it's exactly what you'd expect, right? She's got her mind on many things. But then the cameras went on and she just was a completely different person instantly. And so that was interesting. You know, it was interesting to me that she had both of those approaches so instantaneously at her disposal, you know. And so, of course, the first thing that entered my mind was, well, my eyebrows went up and I thought, okay, which of these two people is the real person, right? And then well, you could say she played devil's advocate. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. She laid out a set of ideological presuppositions, 2 sets actually, her set and my set. And the set of ideological presuppositions that she laid out for my side of the argument bore very little resemblance to anything that I think or say. And so she would ask me a question, which wasn't really a question. It was a barb with bait on the end of it. And I would respond, and then she would tell me...
So you're saying?
Yeah, she would say what I said, except then what she would say had nothing to do with what I'd saying. She was actually...
Quite little to
do. She was fabricating on the fly the person that she hoped, the villain that she hoped I would be, and then insisting that that was me and that denying it was a lie. Essentially, that's what the interview was.
So it's deeply insincere because she was playing an ideological persona, and she wanted you to play one as well.
Well, she wanted me to be the proper foil for that, you know, and was insistent, is the right word, that I abide by that particular decision. But there was more to the interview than that, because it was, I mean, I've had a lot of experience listening to people. Tens of thousands of hours of experience listening to people, because I'm a clinical psychologist and I've had an extensive practice and I've dealt with every sort of person you could possibly imagine, and a very large number of people that you couldn't imagine no matter how long you tried. So I was watching her after the first minute like a clinician instead of like an interviewer. And I was really paying attention to what she was doing. And I truly don't believe that anything she said in that entire interview was true on its own. It was all I actually have a chapter about this in my book called Assume That the Person You're Listening to Knows Something You Don't, which is a taxonomy of conversational types and a discussion about how to engage in a conversation if what you're trying to do is further your knowledge of the truth. If both of you are trying to further your knowledge of the truth, which is a proper conversation, it's the highest form of conversation, not the only form. You could amuse each other too, that's a perfectly good form, or you can have a friendly spar, or you can play a primate dominance hierarchy game, which is very, very common, which is mostly what was happening in that interview. But she was using her words as tools to attain a particular kind of end. And I couldn't exactly figure out what the end was. Some of it would be to dominate the interviewee, especially if that's a person, then that would be contaminated with ideological correctness. You want to dominate your interviewee if you believe that they're wrong from an ideological perspective. And you want to do that, number one, to attain victory, and number two, to buttress your ideological points. Yeah. So there was that. Then there was some devil's advocate, I suppose, and maybe that's more forgivable because you could say that she has a responsibility to do that as a journalist, which I don't believe, by the way. Yeah. Asking difficult questions and playing the devil's advocate are not the same thing, even though sometimes playing the devil's advocate is necessary. And then I think there was an underlay of career grandstanding. I don't know that much about her, and I don't know how she's made her reputation, but she is obviously a combative person, and my suspicions are that she's made a success of putting people, maybe she's made a success of herself in other ways, but she's made a success of herself, at least in part, by putting people uncomfortably on the spot. Yeah. And so all those things were going on at the same time. And then, of course, underneath that is the fact that there was an ideological battle being played out. I would say a threefold ideological battle. There was a battle between her position, which was radically neo-Marxist, postmodernist, I would say. She was arguing against who she thought I was, and so that was the battle. And then there was the position I was trying to put forward, which had virtually nothing to do with what she was discussing.
She was fighting your strawman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it was like I was able to remain reasonably detached during the interview because I realized almost immediately that whoever she was talking to bore very little resemblance to me. Yeah. And so, I mean, she was quite sophisticated in some sense in what she did, because she did manage to sort of... Her claims became so preposterous and so self-contradictory that it was difficult to remain completely detached. And I think, and this was the crux of the interview, and I think the part that's attracted the most attention, she had asked me at one point in a provocatively self-righteous manner just what gave me the right to assume that my privilege of free speech, let's put it that way, gave me the right to potentially offend someone and hurt their feelings. Yeah. And I thought about 6 things at the same time. But the first thing I thought was, you're a journalist. That's the last question in the world you should ever ask someone if you have any genuine integrity as a journalist, because that's all you have as a journalist. You have the right to offend people and hurt their feelings. And so I called her out on that. I said, look, you know, all you've done in the last 20 minutes is everything you possibly could to make me as uncomfortable as you possibly can. Yeah. And I said it in a way that I would say was designed to let her know that I knew exactly what she was doing. And then I suggested that that was actually okay because she had every right to do that, but that she couldn't have it both ways. She couldn't make her living and her reputation using those tactics, let's say. And those are, for her, those weren't tactics of seeking the truth. They were almost purely tactics of domination, right, and one-upmanship. Yeah. And maybe, you know, if you live in the postmodernist world, you don't believe in truth anyways. There's just victory and power games, and so perhaps that's what she was pursuing. I don't know exactly what she was pursuing, but it was so palpably obvious to the two of us at that point that she had in fact done nothing except try to make me uncomfortable, that calling her on it left her speechless. And then that was the only time, I would say, when I actually spoke to the genuine human being instead of the ideological
so the
front.
ideological front, it fell off briefly, and then you said, I got you?
Yeah, well, I would say technically, and this might be interesting for people who are interested in Jungian psychology, if you want to understand what Carl Jung meant by animus possession, which is a very difficult concept, then that interview was a textbook case of having a discussion with someone who is animus possessed. And I can't explain what that means because it's very complicated, but if you go and read Jung and you read about animus possession and you need a demonstration of it so that that you get a sense of what it means, then that interview is exactly indicative of that. And I would say, as advice to people, maybe it's more like education, with anyone who is animus possessed, their goal is to engage you in the argument. If you engage in the argument on the terms they've defined, you lose. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. Yeah. You lose as soon as you engage in the argument. And so what I did in the interview was just not engage in the argument. Yeah. So I wouldn't say I did that with 100% perfection. Yeah. One of my friends, a very smart guy, there was the scene, let's say, where she was taken aback. I said, "Ha, gotcha." And my friend said, you know, maybe you could have played that differently there. Maybe you could have said, all right, so, you know, obviously you just thought about what I said, you know, and maybe we could actually have a real conversation about that. But, you know, I had become somewhat angry, a little bit, at that point, because she had violated the rules that make journalism possible by suggesting that I didn't have the right to make people uncomfortable with my speech. Like she had broken a rule that she shouldn't have broken, in my estimation, and that made me angry. And so I said something that was designed to be witty, hopefully it was witty, and I thought that was a reasonable approach, and maybe it was. But it might have been better to have played it straight and said, look, okay, now we can get somewhere, you know, because we're actually talking now.
Yeah, so you mean that after the "ha, got you," you would have taken control of the conversation?
We could have actually had a conversation. Yeah. We didn't have a conversation. No. Well, it depends on what you mean by conversation. We had a kind of conversation, but what we actually had was a dominance hierarchy dispute. Yeah. Right. Yeah. With an ideological overlay.
Yeah, definitely. So then, it went quite viral, actually. I think it
unbelievable.
Got
it was trending on YouTube.
Yeah.
It was number 7 trending on
number
YouTube.
7.
Number 7, yeah, crazy.
And some loose clips on Facebook also got
hundreds, millions.
Yeah,
of
no,
views.
definitely.
Yeah.
And then
I know Derek Blackman in the U.S. made a clip, and it got 750,000 views in like one day. Yeah.
Then the memes came, and then a day later, it kind of took a joyless turn.
Yeah, yesterday and today, right now. Yeah, well, it's amazing. Well, you see, so here's the strange thing, eh? So I kind of played, let's say, knight on white horse. And so The Guardian yesterday published a astoundingly reprehensible article.
About your book?
No, about the Channel 4 interview. No, they've done some nice interviews about my book. So they've been kind of all over the place with me, you know. But the Channel 4 people claim that Cathy has been targeted with threats, you know, a torrent of online abuse by internet trolls. Yeah. It's like 50,000 trolls, you know, that's a lot of trolls. You might start thinking maybe they're not all trolls, but in any case, overwhelmed by misogynistic abuse and threats, and that they had called in a security specialist to assess the level of threat. And so it was the beginning of the attempt to twist the story around so that the story became Cathy Newman, poor, embattled Channel 4 newscaster, was merely trying to do her job, even though she might have been a bit provocative, interviewed alt-right hero Dr. Jordan Peterson in an honest manner to expose his agenda, posted the results to YouTube, and was immediately mobbed by his army of internet trolls, right? So she went from, so my sense is she went from journalist playing a variety of complicated games to target of criticism online, to heroine, embattled heroine in the panoply of martyrs to whom similar things have happened in the past. And what's terrible about it, and I inadvertently, I would say, contributed to that, because when the Guardian story came out, I read it, and the story purported to be about the threats that she had received. But really the story, because the story opened with a description of me, and the description was, let's call it, far from flattering. Yeah. You know, it was the same old thing. Dr. Peterson, he's a provocateur, has an army of trolls. If anybody ever dares to challenge him, let's say, you know, all they're doing is honestly challenging, the trolls come out, and then they have to fear for their lives. And that was the story.
That's the narrative now.
The threats were just the prerequisite for the story. And then, yeah, like a dozen UK news media sources, the newspapers in particular, have picked this up. Some even more critical of me than that, some in a slightly more balanced fashion. But, and see, when the Guardian story broke, I tweeted something. I said, look, I've looked at the tweet or the YouTube comments, and most of them were merely criticism. But if you're threatening her, well, stop, you know, because we had an exchange of words, which is what we're supposed to do.
I think this message to your followers was one of the most liked tweets you ever put out.
Yeah, but here's the terrible thing about it. You know, what happened was that the fact that I tweeted that was instantly used as validation for the claim that there were threats. And that was just, that's what happened. And see, it's weird, because when I wrote that, I thought, there's part of me that thought that might happen. There was a little warning bell that went off that said, look, you know, there's no evidence that these threats are credible. And if you respond by asking people to back off, you're also implying that there are people who should back off, that this is real. And I thought, no, I'm going to do it anyways, because she has been targeted. She has been subject to a very large number of very vitriolic comments. And maybe that's enough. And so, you know, it's okay to come out and say that's enough. But the thing is, it wasn't okay, because as soon as I did it, then the fact that I did it was used as proof that all of these claims were valid. And that just floored me. Like, I was very distraught, I think is the right word, about that this morning, because I didn't see that coming.
But were there threats against her? Have you seen them?
Define threat.
Threats of violence?
There's no threats that were sufficient to get the police involved. So what they see, the Guardian was very vague about what the threats were and how and who these security people were. They were vague about that. But the implication was that the threats were serious enough so that security people needed to be called in to advise. Okay, well, the narrative is clarified a little bit in the last day. Now they just said, well, they had security consultants come in to look at the threats. Well, so then you think, well, is that because they're actually concerned about the threats? Or is that because they want to spin off a story about how the threats are so severe that they had to call in security consultants? And like, I have a strong, so let's say it's 10% the former and 90% the latter, which is what I would estimate. And so, but it doesn't matter now, because the narrative has already been twisted around. Now, I don't know if that's going to, I have no idea if that's going to actually backfire on Channel 4, or if it will have the effect of further damaging my reputation. I mean, I know the Canadian media has picked up the victimized Cathy Newman narrative and run with it, as well as
they're certainly trying. The Independent, I think, was a piece today, has a subtitle: "When white men feel they are losing power, any level of nastiness is possible." In the struggle to regain.
I know that was definitely one of the most appalling headlines that I've ever seen a credible news organization produce. And they see, one of the things I pointed out in my book in 12 Rules for Life is that as a clinician, talking to many hundreds of people for many thousands of hours and watching how things unfold in their life from the earliest stages of their childhood memories to their current state of life and into the future. One thing I have learned is that no one ever gets away with anything. And so this reporter has made a kind of statement, a kind of provocative statement, and he or she doesn't understand that there will be consequences of that. And perhaps not the sort of consequences that the author will tie back to that statement, but that's a statement that you only make if you are very historically ignorant, or very incautious, or if there's a very dark part of you hoping things will go very wrong very soon. And I would say that there's a reasonable possibility that things are going to go very wrong very soon.
For whom?
For all of us. For all of us. None of what's happening in this polarized atmosphere is amusing to me. What happened, see, even with the Channel 4 interview, you know, and maybe I was a bit self-congratulatory, let's say, when I made my sort of satirical gotcha statement. I'm not, and then I would say you could read what happened with Channel 4 as a victory for me and as a loss for Cathy. Now, depends on what she was aiming at. If she was aiming at 3 million views on YouTube in 2 days, then it's not a loss. You know, and for me, it's like, well, my book went up to #2 on Amazon.com in the US the next day, right? It's #1 in Canada. It's #3 in the UK, all on Amazon. I couldn't have asked for more publicity, right? No. And so I could also be sitting back and saying, well, you know, she tried to, a person who regarded herself as my ideological opponent tried to go after my philosophy and my reputation on national TV, failed brutally, and has been taken apart for it. It's like, this is a good day. But I don't regard it as a good day. I don't think it's a good day.
As what do you regard it?
I think that it's evidence of the instability of the times that we're in. It would have been much better for me and for everyone else if what we would have had was a real conversation. So it's not good. Yeah. It's not good. And I asked Cathy in a variety of different ways now if she would sit down and have an actual conversation, because the right way for this to end is not for me to declare victory, because I don't regard it as a victory. I mean, I'm not saying that I would have liked to have the tables turned. I'm not saying that I would have been happy with a loss. Yeah. But what happened in there was not an optimized victory. What we need to do, what would be best, is if she would sit down with me for about an hour.
On camera as well?
On camera, where we could actually have a discussion. Like, I would like to ask her something, for example. I've been trying to puzzle this out. I saw a picture of her today that was a tweet. It was a tweet by one of her friends, and they said that the tweet was something like, we're amusing ourselves watching the Twitter comments while waiting for the police investigation. Okay, and then there's a picture of Cathy holding a tablet, you know, looking shocked in a very pleased way, I think is the right way of, and you see, that's kind of what I'm worried about, is that she is shocked in a rather pleased way.
Was this the police investigation into the threats to her?
Presumably, it wasn't clear, but presumably. Yeah. But
I think she removed those tweets.
She did remove them, but it's hard to remove things from Twitter. Yeah. And so, but I've also been sitting here thinking, like, you know, people write me and they say, well, you must be, I'm writing you a letter of support, you must be receiving an overwhelming amount of hate mail, you know, keep up the good work. I don't receive any hate mail. I received like 5 pieces of hate mail in the last 15 months. I can't believe that that's the case.
Very modest number.
Yeah, and they weren't particularly vitriolic. Yeah, they were criticisms, you know. Yeah. So I don't get hate mail. Now, I don't know why, but I don't. But, you know, if the tables were turned, you know, and if I had done an interview and then 50,000 people had written critical comments about me in 2 days, ranging from like pretty severely critical to pretty damn vitriolic, I would be having a rough time of it, man. I'd be sitting there thinking, Jesus, you know, what the hell did I do? What did I do that was so deeply wrong that this was the result? But I don't know what Cathy's thinking.
That does not seem to constitute her response so far.
Well, you know, I hesitate to guess at it. but there's no evidence that that's her response.
Yeah.
You know, she said, oh, well, it was all in good fun. It was part of the game. Thank you for being a good sport. It's not a game for me.
Viva feminism?
Yeah, exactly. Viva feminism. We're really, and I mean, what my impression of the response to her interview is that virtually everyone watching it online, and I'm judging this response by the number of likes to dislikes and the comments, which are running about 80 to 1
Yeah.
against her, which is like 50 to 1 against you is not good.
Yeah.
Like 80 to 1 against you is really, really not good.
Yeah.
There's something wrong. And so, and these aren't trolls. These aren't my army of trolls. These 3 million people who've watched the video, or it's more than that actually, that's all sorts of people everywhere.
Yeah.
And they're not happy with the way the interview went. And that would crush me.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the right response to that. It's like when you receive overwhelming public criticism like that, the right response should be not glee at stirring up the hornet's nest, but careful reanalysis of what you did.
That's hard.
It's not as hard as the alternative, because if you're riding high and there's a correction coming and you keep forestalling it, the correction will get larger and larger and larger and larger, and finally when it comes you will not be able to tolerate it. And that's the situation I believe that she's in. The correction is coming.
Has she responded to your request to sit down again?
No, but it's been made very, very, recently.
Okay. Okay.
So I've had a colleague of hers contacted me and said that he would do what he could to put us in touch, and other people have, been working behind the scenes, and
Yeah.
I suggested it on Twitter, and I'm likely going to contact my press agents at Penguin and see if they want to contact her and ask. But because that's the right outcome. The right outcome is we had this bit of combat, let's say. It produced a scandal. Now we actually talk about it.
Yeah.
No tricks,
Yeah.
just a conversation. And then everybody wins, right? Because I can admit whatever mistakes I made, she can admit whatever mistakes she made, we can drop the persona,
Yeah.
which is what she had.
Yeah,
It was an
definitely.
animus-possessed persona, technically speaking. She could drop that, we could actually have a discussion.
Yeah.
Like, I would open the discussion by asking her why she was taken aback when I asked her about her treatment of me in the interview.
Yeah.
And people have also been spinning that as my claims to have been victimized in the interview. So, which is another sign of how pathological the discourse has become.
Yeah.
Because pointing out what's happening and claiming some kind of victim status are by no means the same thing.
Yeah. So what you're saying, that although it might look as a victory for you, and the attention it has
It's not
generated,
a healthy victory.
it's not a healthy victory.
Right.
And taking back to that, you said that it's actually a sign of the times where things could go really wrong for all of us really soon.
Yeah, we're playing with fire.
Yeah, what do you mean by this? Can you elaborate?
Well, things go wrong in cultures all the time, right? You get the polarization increases until people start to act it out. I mean, I'll give you an example. I always pay attention to what happens at the back of my mind, to the bottom of my mind, let's say. And what I learned from Carl Jung, for example, one thing was that if you watch what happens in your imagination while you're speaking and while things are happening to you, you'll see little dreamlike fragments happening all the time. Mm-hmm. They're not in words, they're really more like brief dreams. Jung thought we were dreaming all the time, even when we were awake. And, today I was reviewing maybe 10 or 11 of these newspaper articles that had played this twisty game and accused me of sicking my internet trolls on the poor hapless journalist. And I thought, this was the dark part of me, right? That's the shadow part, thought, if I wanted to sick my internet trolls on Channel 4, then there'd be nothing but broken windows and riots. And then there's a little part of me that thinks, wouldn't that be fun? Right, and that's where we're at. It's like, because I'm a reasonable person, a very reasonable person,
But
even though I
have
can...
these thoughts in the back of your mind.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
and I pay attention to them because I know that they're part of the collective unconscious, right?
Yeah.
They're the shadow part. And
Yeah, yeah.
when there's part of me thinking, well, wouldn't that just be perfectly goddamn delightful? Then there's lots of people who are not only thinking that way sometimes, but thinking that way all the time. And they're just waiting for that to be the proper response. You see this with the Antifa violence in the United States and with the Charlottesville thing as well.
So, but basically what you're saying is that when you have these dark thoughts in your mind, in the back of your mind, you kind of tap into the collective unconscious of the culture you're embedded in.
Definitely, definitely. There's no doubt about it, is that like the dark part of me and the dark part of you is the same thing in some ways, you know, and we live in the same culture. And so it's going to manifest itself in a similar manner.
Yeah. So you're saying the polarization that we're seeing right now, that we are speaking out, it's not, in the future we will act out that polarization.
Well, if we keep accelerating it, especially if we keep accelerating it with lies, you know, and this whole Channel 4 rat's nest is like 90% lies, maybe more. And, you know, a lot of it's ideologically motivated lies, but it doesn't matter. It's still lies. Like Cathy, as I said, there was virtually nothing she said in that interview that was actually coming from her, like a deep part of her, the soul of her.
All persona.
It was all persona. It was all persona, and all use of words in a expedient manner as tools to obtain, I think, probably status, dominant status, and reputation. Yeah.
So this is kind of the part where I want to go to the next part of this talk, because people know you from your, it's not actually activism, but your stand against postmodernism and identity.
My refusal to abide by the dictates of compelled speech. Right.
That's what most people know you from. But what fewer people know is your philosophy on how to be in the world properly as an individual. And I think that...
Yeah, I don't know which people know more about. I mean, I would say that the typical person, like there's people who live in the old media world, and there's people who live in the new media world, and the people who live in the old media world, they know me for that. But the people who live in the new media world, I wouldn't say that's the case for.
That's a good point. I was referring to the people in the old.
Okay. Well, it's weird that we have to make that distinction, but it's necessary because we're in the time where those distinctions are the case.
Yeah. So the thing is, my view on this is, if you implement your philosophy on how to be in the world, you become less susceptible to ideological possession, which is...
Well, that's the hope.
Yeah, which is kind of the meta importance of that part of your work, I think. As I told you, I've watched most of your lectures, and I've tried to distill it back to 5 points, which in my view are the 5 strongest points. I will list them now in summary, and then we'll unpack them more. Yeah,
well, you nailed one of them right away. It's like, I mean, I have my conscious goal since learning what I've learned, which I would say occurred back in the mid to late 80s, you know, when I learned the basic principles that I've been elaborating upon over the last 30 years or so. Once I learned those, then the hope was that sharing that knowledge would make people immune to ideological possession. That was the goal,
I think this is one of your closing remarks in Maps of Meaning. You say that the problem to society's ills is the integrity of the individual. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to list the 5 points.
Fine.
Yeah. So, point 1, the absolute centrality of the archetypical hero's myth. Point 2, your main instrument during this hero's narrative is the logos. Point 3, the way to be in the world is to orient yourself towards the highest possible good you can conceive of, because it's not as if you have anything better to do. 4, make the right sacrifices to walk with God, and in this sentence, the concept of God as a judgmental father is an articulation of the discovery of being able to bargain with the future. And 5, minimize your persona, cultivate your essence, and live in its closest possible proximity.
No, that's, you know,
I think these
for a distillation into 5, that's pretty good.
Yeah. So, first, let's start with the first point, the centrality of the archetypical hero's myth. What is the archetypical hero's myth? What makes it archetypical? And what is a hero? Could you elaborate on this?
Well, imagine that you have a problem, and then imagine that you want a solution. And imagine that there's a particular solution to that particular problem. But then imagine that you have what you might describe as a bigger problem, and that's not the problem. It's the fact that you have problems, because that's the real problem. The real problem is the fact that you have problems. And then you might say, well, you don't want a solution to our problem. You want a solution to the fact that you have problems. And so it's a leap of abstraction, right? So then you might say, well, is there a way of conceptualizing the set of all problems that's universal? And I think there is. I mean, that's what religious stories try to do. And they do it using dramatic means, because the problem is so complex, so that's the meta problem. It's so complex that we don't really know how to formulate it. But that's what we're struggling towards. So it's like, well, what's the problem of life? Something like that. Well, you could say that the problem of life, and I outlined this quite carefully in 12 Rules for Life. The problem of life is this. We're finite and mortal. That's problem number one. So the first problem is that life is essentially tragic. It's little us against infinity. Yeah. And we lose. And not only do we lose, but we lose in a manner that produces a substantial amount of suffering, and sometimes an unbearable amount. So it's a big problem. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is that that's true, plus malevolence exists in the world, evil exists in the world, and makes that first problem even worse than it would have to be. And that's universally true for everyone all the time. That's archetypal. So when you formulate a situation archetypally, you speak about it in a manner that's eternally true. So there's lots of ways that you and I differ, but there's many ways that we're the same. And so that would be what constitutes our essential humanity, let's say. And what makes us the same is that, like you, I'm mortal, and my life is finite, and my existence is characterized by suffering, and I have to contend with the fact of malevolence in the world. And it's the terribly destructive character of the natural world, it's the tyrannical element of the social world, and it's the adversarial element of myself and every other individual. Yeah. So that's the malevolent element. Yeah. And so we're stuck with that. Okay, fine. That's the archetypal formulation of the problem. You could say that's the mythic landscape, right? And it's something like good and evil in a world of chaos and order. It's something like that. Yeah. It's very interesting. You know, there are games online that have that as their basic structure, right? The game developers have figured this out. So that's pretty interesting. Okay, so then the question is, well, how do you comport yourself in a landscape of chaos and order, and when the game is good versus evil, something like that? Well, then that's where the idea of the archetypal hero emerges. And the archetypal hero is the person whose eyes are open and whose speech is true, and who faces both the chaos of the unknown and the tyranny of the known and balances them, right? And then you think, well, and that's the antidote to the problem. That's the meta solution to the meta problem. And it's something like, in a more straightforward form, and this is something that I spoke about because I was speaking in Holland here in the Netherlands 2 nights ago about European and Dutch identity and how to solve, let's say, the conundrums that are associated with a multicultural world and immigration. And my suggestion was, well, it's a very complex problem. There isn't a solution. But the solution to a very complex problem is you should be a better person than you are, because then you'd be better at solving complex problems. And lots of them are coming your way. So bloody well get your act together. And that's what I've been telling people. And but more than that, because it's more than that, because that's merely burdening people with excess responsibility, let's say. So that can be a crushing message. You're not who you could be. You know, get your bloody act together. You're whining away in the corner, and you're no good to yourself and anyone else. You know, it's harsh. But then there's another element to that, which is there's way more to you than you think you are, and that you have something necessary and vital to contribute to the world, and if you don't contribute it, that things will happen that aren't good, and that's terrible for you and everyone else. So it's not only that you need to do this because it's your responsibility, but you need to understand that there isn't anything better that you could do for yourself or for anyone else.
Yeah.
And people are dying to hear that message.
Yeah.
So
that resonates with young men.
yeah, well, it's so amazing. Like, I'm in this very weird situation right now, to say the least. It's surreal. My life has been surreal for a long time. It's like being in a Delhi painting, you know. I continually can't believe it, and I mean continually, you know.
Does feel that psychedelic to you?
Oh yeah, it's completely. Well, it's so strange, you know. Like, when I got to England, for example, to London. My wife and I were staying at this little Airbnb, and we went out to get some groceries, and so I walked into the grocery store. We were only out for about an hour, and somebody recognized me in the grocery store and came up and said, look, you know, I was in a kind of desperate situation, and I was feeling pretty nihilistic and depressed, and I really wasn't paying attention to my life, and I was watching your videos, and like, thank you, it's really helped me straighten myself out. It's like, oh, hell, you know, hey, great. And so then I went into the electronics store next door, and some guy came up to me and he said exactly the same thing. And so, like, wherever I go now, well, people come up to me, so they're just, I wouldn't call them random strangers, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, they are,
Yeah.
and they say, they have their own personal take on it, you know, because they usually tell me in which particular way they were feeling nihilistic and vengeful and saddened and unable to pull themselves together.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. And then, you know, when I did this talk, I did 3 talks in London, and you know, we started with one theatre of 300 people, which was, you know, Penguin UK was hoping that we'd do a credible job and sell some tickets, and I could talk to about the book, and it sold out instantly.
Yeah,
and then, yeah, it said that they told me that it sold out faster than any event they'd ever hosted. And it's like, so they put up another one with 1,000 people, and it sold out right away. And then they put up another one with 1,000 people, and it sold out right away. And so then I went and talked to these, you know, at these venues, and people are overwhelmingly welcoming. It's crazy. And then afterwards, you know, like 500 people line up, and they all say the same thing. I've been watching your videos. That's like really helped me out. Yeah. It's like, how could you not feel that your life was surreal when that's happening?
Yeah, I can imagine. I think what's happening, I see this online and in the memes and kind of in the meme culture around you. I think what's happening essentially is that the hero's myth resonates so strongly with young men. It's kind of it's a basic narrative. You descend into the underworld. You go where you least want to look.
Yeah. Because you rescue your father.
Yeah, yeah. Because in filth it will be found.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And
that which you most need is to be found where you least want to look.
Yeah, it's a King Arthur theme.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. It's the whole theme of the Holy Grail. That's exactly right. Well, so there's a little story that goes along with that. So King Arthur and his knights are all sitting around a round table, which implies that they're of equal stature, essentially. And they go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is the container of that which redeems. It's something like that. But of course, who the hell knows where to look for the Holy Grail? Yeah. So each of the knights decides to enter the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. Right, and that's a hell of a story, because first of all, it shows that courage is the first requirement, right? Yeah. Because you look for what's darkest and you go in there. That's part of, you know, Jung developed that idea quite substantially with regards to his notion of the shadow. And it's also, I think it's also what makes this believable for people, because, you know, the alternative is something like, well, you know, look for happiness. And everyone thinks, well, I'd rather be happy than miserable, and like, fair enough, you know, but there's nothing about that has any nobility, and it's not believable. No one believes that, because everyone knows that life is bounded by tragedy and that malevolence abounds. Everyone knows that. Yeah. So, and you say, you know, so there's that terrible dark dyad of tragedy and evil, and you wave the little flag of happiness in front of it. It's like, you know, no one believes that will work. But then when you tell people, look, you're dark, you're a monster, you really are, but that's actually useful, because you cannot survive the world without being a monster. People think, oh, well, that's interesting. I kind of suspected that I was a monster, and everyone's always said that was bad. And it is bad, obviously, but there's something that can be done about it, and there's something that can be transmuted into something good without being inhibited. Yeah. So you're saying To be good, I don't have to be a neutered tomcat. To be good, I can be a monster, but I can be like a civilized monster. It's like, yeah, that's what you should aim at. You should be unbelievably dangerous. The more dangerous you are, the better. And then you should control that.
Because that's your doctrine on what constitutes morality, right? It's contained capacity for malevolence.
For mayhem.
For mayhem.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and I learned this partly from Jung, but also partly from Nietzsche. And of course, Jung learned it partly from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche pointed out that most of what passes for morality is just obedient cowardice.
Yeah.
So I'm an obedient coward. Well, no one wants to think that. So they say, well, no, I'm not an obedient coward. I'm a good person because I don't break any rules. It's like, no, you're not. You're an obedient coward, and you're too afraid to break the rules. That doesn't make you good. It also accounts for why the dark hero, the anti-hero, is so popular in cinematic representations in particular, because people go and watch the mafia hitmen and guys like that, and they, there's a dark part of them that thinks, wow, those guys are really cool. Like movies like Quentin Tarantino's movies, where the hitmen are wisecracking and they're tough and they can handle everything, and you think, well, these guys are psychopathic criminals. Why are people looking up to them? It's because, well, you're not moral if you're just harmless. And the question is, well, what's the antidote to being harmless? And the antidote to that is to open up that doorway into the shadow. And then you could become that, right? There's that gleeful, predatory victory that's part of that, and that would be associated with, let's say, the attitude that I could have had to what happened with Channel 4. It's like, I won. Yeah. Look the fuck out. Right. But no, that's not right, because it's not good enough. It's better than losing by a lot, because there's nothing in a loss that's admirable, but it's not the highest form of victory, and there's no reason not to go for the highest form of victory, and that's peace. Right? It's not predatory victory, it's peace, because anyone with any sense, who has any wisdom, regards peace as the goal. And that isn't the peace that means that I'm so afraid of you that I'm not going to say anything. It's the peace that is that, like, it's the peace of armed opponents who respect one another. Right, that's real peace.
Harking back to the hero's myth one more time, do you think that basically all people need to complete this narrative at some stage in their lives? Do all people need?
It is their lives. Like, if you don't act this out, let's say, you're not living, you're fragmented. You're a puppet. You're a puppet of other motivational forces. Like, this is what happens when you unite the motivational forces that guide you. Unite your own nature with your own culture and rise up above it. That's what happens, is you end up acting this out in one way or another. And you might as well know it. And this was Jung's point. It's like, you can be the unconscious actor of a malevolent, tragic drama. Or you can wake the hell up, and you can decide that you're going to be the hero of not only your story, but of everyone's story. And then you can choose. Which of those do you want? Now, the problem with choosing, let's call it the archetypally heroic path, is that you have to take the responsibility. But the upside is, well, what the hell's the difference between responsibility and opportunity? You could say, well, there's no difference between responsibility and opportunity. So the more responsibility you take, the more opportunity you have. Now, maybe you don't want that, because you'd rather cower in the corner and hide. But the thing is that you probably wouldn't rather do that, because if you try it, you'll find that there's nothing in it but self-contempt and misery. Right? That's a bad pathway to pull back and to fail to engage in the world, and you end up bitter and resentful and self-destructive and vengeful and then far worse. That's you can develop a liking for that. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah. No, I understand. I was summarizing like the cinematic history of the past 15 years, and there were a few characters that I found particularly archetypical. And I was wondering, because I don't think you've ever mentioned these in your lectures. So there's Maximus from Gladiator. There's Hector of Troy from Troy, who faces off against Achilles. There's King Leonidas from 300 with the Spartans, and there's Spartacus. And what stood out to me was these are all deeply archetypical figures, and they have a few core core properties in common. One is they talk very little, and if they talk very decisive. Two is they never or seldom raise their voice. Only if they raise their voice, it's so the troops can hear them. And three, I think that within these archetypes might reside the case, maybe the ultimate case for male monogamy. Because these archetypes that resonate so strongly with men, what they all have in common is that they're fiercely loyal to one woman alone.
Right. Well, that's part of them. That's part of the incorporation of the shadow, I would say, because, you know, Louis C.K. a while back talked about Tiger Woods, and I really liked it because people were complaining about Tiger Woods and his affairs, and also about Arnold Schwarzenegger and his affairs, and one of the things that Louis C.K. pointed out, quite in a very comical manner, was that, well, many men aren't having the affairs of Tiger Woods. But that's not because they're good men, it's because they don't have, I think he said, a busload of Swedish bikini models waiting for them at the final hole. So the idea would be that you should conduct yourself so that you are attractive to many women, maybe that you have your pick of them, but then you should pick one. And that's a sacrifice. Obviously, that's a sacrifice of a sort. It's a strange sacrifice because, you know, I talked to someone, a comedian recently, who told me of one of his experiences in Las Vegas. So he went to Las Vegas with a sports superstar. And they went to a party, and what literally happened at the party was one woman brought forward a small group of other women, all very attractive, and basically told the sports legend that he could just pick one of them and she would go home with him, right? And so that had all been arranged beforehand, and he said that he's been in many situations where something like that has happened. And I thought, well, you know, that sort of is appealing to the Hugh Hefner playboy 14-year-old fantasy that sort of gripped our culture from the 1960s onward. But imagine that you sleep casually with 100 women in a 6-month period, or a 3-month period for that matter, or a 3-week period. I don't care, pick your time frame. And you say, well, what, and you're ecstatic with yourself because you've been validated by this opportunity. And I'm not making light of that. It's not nothing to be attractive to women like that. It's really something to be attractive to women like that. But it isn't obvious to me that your choice to conduct yourself in that manner enriches your life and the life of other people more in any way than picking one person and actually having a relationship with them. It's only true that that promiscuous pathway, let's say, is better if you can actually divorce sexuality from all the other elements of life. You say, well, it's about variety and it's about impulsive pleasure. Or maybe it could be even slightly deeper than merely impulsive pleasure. It could be shared impulsive pleasure. But I don't think you can do that because sexuality isn't divorceable from family and from morality and from all the other elements of your life. And if you're mature, you know that. And so you make a decision. You make a decision not to capitalize on your opportunity, not to misuse your opportunities. And you know, a huge part of the Me Too phenomena, a huge part of this battle that's being played out in our culture is a consequence of the failure of men to recognize that. Now, it's not only the failure of men, let me be absolutely clear about that, because, for example, with the example of the sports superstar, the women who are lining up in front of him, parading themselves and offering themselves, are deeply complicit in this pathological game. And so it's pretty clear anthropologically as well that, you know, sexual choice tends towards a Pareto distribution, especially for men. So most men have very little selection at their disposal, and a small number of men have excess opportunities. The question is, what should that small number of men do? And you might say, capitalize on it and to hell with the consequences. And like, it's a powerful argument, but I do believe it's wrong. It destabilizes the society. And so, and I also don't think it does your soul any good, because the problem with treating other people as casual sexual partners, let's say, is that you also treat yourself that way simultaneously. And I don't think that that does you any good, because you're not, unless that's what you want to be. If you want to be a casual partner, it's like, well, that's, I wouldn't say that's a particularly noble ambition. You should be able to do better than that.
All right, so we just discussed the centrality in your philosophy of the archetypical hero's myth, which is basically one descends into the underworld, you go where you least want to look, you face the dragon goddess of chaos, you fight with all you have and a little more, and if you survive, you retrieve something of supreme value and you escort it back into the daylight.
And then you share it with everyone else.
And then you share it, yeah.
Which is a crucial part, crucial part of it.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely. So the second point is actually, within your philosophy, it seems that during this narrative that I just described, the logos is your premier instrument. And you describe the logos as the capacity to articulate undifferentiated chaos into habitable order.
Into the habitable order that is good.
Yeah, that
right,
is good.
Right,
Yeah.
which is like an elaboration that I kind of figured out last year when I was doing the biblical lectures, right? Because one of the things I came to understand when I was reanalyzing the earliest chapter in Genesis is that there's this idea in Genesis that the creative force, God, uses this process, employs this process, the logos, to extract habitable order from chaotic potential.
He speaks the world into being.
Right, but he uses the logos specifically to do it. Then the logos is truthful speech. And so there's an idea there, which is that it's a deep idea. It's the deepest idea of the West, I would say. And it's the deepest religious idea. So, but I think it's been, I don't know if it's been articulated best in the West, but I would say you could make a case for that. But in any case, the idea is that there's a way to bring order into being that makes the order good, and that's to bring it into being by spoken truth. So you can extract new being out of potential by lying, but
That's
then
not good.
No, it's hellish.
Yeah.
It's hellish.
So it's order, but hellish order, tyrannical order. Yeah.
Right, it's tyrannical order, generally speaking. Well, and we know that to be the case.
Yeah.
It's not like this is some metaphysical speculation. If you read Solzhenitsyn, for example, or Viktor Frankl, people like that, who've deeply meditated on the relationship between malevolence and tyranny, I mean, they just lay it out clearly. In a true tyranny, everyone lies about everything all the time. And that's why it's hell. And that's exactly right.
Because
exactly right.
You said that in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Germany, 1 in 3 people was a government informer.
Informer, yeah, that's right.
That's insane.
It's the very definition of social pathology.
Yeah.
Because, well, if you can't say what you think, then you don't know who you are. You can't live.
Yeah.
You have to live as a crippled person, a self-crippling person. It's like you're taking a sledgehammer to your shins. You know, it's you and everyone else, and it's brutal and murderous. And
one of the things that's so profound about the concept of the logos, because you refer to Genesis, but actually it's older. It's Babylonian, right? It's from the Enuma Elish.
Well, it's older. It's even older than that, right? I mean, it's as old as humanity itself, in some sense. I would say it's the central process by which human beings flourish in the world. So yeah, it's as old as higher consciousness is. It's something like that.
Yeah. So. And you've also stated that actually that Western legal systems are predicated on the notion that people possess the logos.
That's what it looks like to me, yeah. I mean, well, because the individual has sovereignty in the West. We have a rule here, a meta rule, which is that the individual is not above the rules. It's not that. It's that the rules encounter a boundary where they hit the individual. So that even if you're a murderer, even if everyone knows you did it, say, you still have to be treated with the dignity that you would grant to someone who possesses the capacity to conquer chaos and revitalize tyrannical order. You have to, the law itself has to draw to a halt in front of that. And that's, people don't understand how amazing it is that that principle ever emerged, because the impulsive, correct response to the revelation of a murderer in your midst is to just kill him as brutally and rapidly as possible. And you think, well, why not? He deserves it. It's like, well, you could make a case that he deserves it. I mean, you can make a strong case for that, especially if you happen to be the relative of the victim, let's say.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. The point is that there's something even deeper at stake that's real. And I believe that respect for that logos, let's say, which is something that's a co-creator of being and also something that is possessed of free will, those are the ideas. That without that respect, you cannot establish a harmonious relationship with yourself because you don't know who you are. You cannot establish a real friendship or intimate relationship with anyone else. You can't be a good parent. You can't take your place in your local community, and you can't be a productive, useful citizen. All of that.
If you're not in touch with your logos?
Exactly. It's the principle. When your relationships are working, whether they're with yourself or with one or many people, if they're working to the degree that they're guided by that principle. Well, it's simple in some ways. It's like, well, you and I want to get along, let's say. Well, the first question, the last question even is, well, do we trust each other? You know, and we test each other out constantly. It's like, well, you know, maybe I want to see if I can rely on you a little bit. So I tell you something that's a little rough, something I need a little help with maybe, or I reveal something about myself. Then I watch. And then maybe you have some sense and you listen. And you reveal something about yourself that's about the same magnitude. Then we sit and think, okay, that went all right. That exchange was fair. And then maybe I think, okay, well, let's just push this a little bit farther. So I lay another card on the table and you do the same. And it's like, well, soon we find out that there's reciprocity, so we're tracking the exchanges, and that we can each be relied upon. It's like, great, well, I can rely on you. Well, good, now we can go off and try something difficult together. And that binds us together even more tightly. Well, every relationship is like that. But
is this the logos you're referring to? Because in my understanding, the logos is just the capacity to articulate chaos into order.
But that's what we're doing when we're mediating in the space between us. That's what we're doing in this conversation.
So the space between us, well, we just met.
Right.
So there's a chaotic potential here.
Yeah.
And we can articulate this into...
Yeah, the potential is that we just met.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, you don't know me, I don't know you. So what's going to come of this?
Yeah.
Well, many potential things. Well, and we're having this conversation that's going to be watched by many people. So we're bringing, by having this discussion, we're reshaping the potential that lies in front of us into something actual.
Yeah.
And we're determining with every gesture, every word, what that order is going to be. And you're doing that all the time with people. And you know, one of the things that's really struck me is that people know this. And I talk to people, I say, well, your parents are going to say to you, people who love you will say, you're not living up to your potential. And if they're serious about that, then that strikes at your heart. You think, oh my God, I'm not living up to my potential. That's like the ultimate sin. There's part of you that knows that. You think, well, I should be like making more of myself. I should be living up to my potential. And you never stop and sit back and think, what is this potential that we're referring to? What do we mean by that potential? And what sort of reality does it have? Well, it's only potential. What sort of reality does it have? It has no reality. It's only potential. Well, it's a weird, what would you call it? It's not even a category. Well, maybe it's a category. Man, that's the best I can do on the spur of the moment. We all act as if potential is real and that it can be transformed by our choices.
Yeah. So when people say to me, "Hey, you're not living up to your potential," they're actually saying you're not articulating order from chaos.
Yes.
As you could.
Yes, or the corollary is that you're also not standing up to tyranny, like, you know, you're not recasting tyrannical order like you should be. Yeah. It's both of those.
Yeah. So there's chaos on the one side and tyrannical order on the other.
Yeah, exactly.
And the logos mediates between them.
Yes, and so sometimes, and you see this in the story of Christ quite clearly, because first, especially in the extended version, let's say, where Christ is also the logos that exists at the beginning of time. It's like, well, that's the word that brings forth order from chaos, but the incarnate Christ, let's say, the logos made flesh, that's a way of looking at it, has a social revolutionary element to him. So he's standing up constantly against the Pharisees and the lawyers, right, the forces of tyranny. And so he's more in in the actual passion story, he's more of a combatter of corrupt order than someone who's calling forth order from chaos. That's the more abstract level. But both of them are integrally part of the hero story. The hero's always doing one of those two things. So
when you think about the logos, is this the element that makes the individual possess a certain divinity in your?
Yeah, it's indistinguishable from the divinity of the individual. It's the same thing. It's the divine principle of the individual. And then one question might be, well, you could say, well, what's the phenomenological status of that? Which would be, how do you experience that? And you experience that in many ways. You experience that as a sense of meaning when you're doing something meaningful. So that's a direct experience of it. You can experience it in a more metaphysical way, and people experience that when they experience feelings of the infinite, intimations of the infinite, intimations of immortality. That's another way of thinking about it. And those can happen when you're listening to music. They can happen in sexual encounters. There's all sorts of rituals that might evoke them. Micro examples occur when you're working and you're deeply engaged in what you're doing and you're finding it meaningful. You can make contact with the part of you that seems infinite in scope. And those are the sorts of experiences that people usually refer to as mystical. And you might think, well, those are just forms of insanity. That would be a classic psychiatric materialist objection. But the problem is the evidence doesn't support that idea. The evidence suggests that mystical experiences have a profoundly positive effect on all aspects of people's lives. Now, that doesn't mean they can't go wrong. Schizophrenics sometimes have mystical experiences, but they're
less constructive.
It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, and it shouldn't be confused. There's no evidence that it's the same thing, and the two things shouldn't be. And there's plenty of evidence that they're not the same thing. They shouldn't be confused. And so, so that's the phenomenological level. You can experience these things, and people have strived to experience them throughout human history. I mean, almost all the things we do that are cultural, like deeply cultural, all our forms, let's say, of entertainment, which is a very bad way of thinking about it, are attempts to produce those intimations of the divine. And people love that more than anything, and no wonder. You couldn't say, well, that doesn't mean that there's any such thing as divine. It's like, well, that's a whole different argument.
Maybe not divine, but transcendent nonetheless.
Well, it's good enough. I'm not necessarily engaging in metaphysical speculation. When I did the biblical lectures, for example, I tried to stay on psychological grounds. Say, look, just read psychologically, these stories are sufficient. I do believe that there's a metaphysical reality to the experiences of the intimations of immortality and divine unity that people are capable of having. I believe there is metaphysical grounds for those. I believe they're reflective of a deeper reality. But you don't have to believe that in order to view this from a psychological or pragmatic perspective.
So what I really enjoyed, I actually thoroughly enjoy it in my day-to-day life, when I started to articulate the concept of the logos for myself. Every morning when I wake up, I think, hey, I have a logos and I can start to create order out of something chaotic. I can start to explore territory and bring it into my map of the world.
That's right. There's chaos to encounter and giants to fight.
Yeah, it's quite fun.
Yes, absolutely. It's more fun than anything else.
I know.
It's better than fun. That's the thing that's so remarkable.
How would you call it if not fun?
Meaningful.
Meaningful.
It's meaningful, man. And it's better. And the reason to distinguish it from fun is that fun doesn't work when you're not having fun. Fun doesn't work when you have people in your family that are suffering or when you're in a crisis. That's not fun. But this works then too, maybe even better. So that's, it's a boat that doesn't sink in a storm. It's an adventure. That's the other thing. It's an adventure. So, or maybe it's even the adventure. So you wake up in the morning and you think, exactly that. There are dragons to slay and giants to fight. It's like, yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think this is a good point to go to our third point. The way to be in the world is to orient yourself to the highest possible good you can conceive, because you don't have anything better to do. You also say that you encourage people to take on as much responsibility as they can, and because this constitutes a meaningful life. And this is, I find this quite interesting. You know what is meaningful because it is encoded into your body, the notion of meaningfulness.
Oh yeah.
And
it's the deepest of the higher instincts.
Yeah.
That's a good way of thinking about it.
My reading of this was that, now it's actually your reading, but what constitutes meaning is the right balance between chaos and order. And this is actually what you described as paradise on earth, being a walled garden where chaos, the chaotic potential, and the logos mediate supreme beauty. And
harmony.
Yeah.
Harmony is a good way of thinking about it, because, well, people understand harmony because they listen to music.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, you listen to a piece of music you love, it's like, that's harmony. It's like, well, how would you like things to be like that? It's like, there's not a question. The fact that you love the piece of music means that you want things to be that way. It's direct. It's not mediated by cognition. Yeah.
No, it's something else.
Huh? It is something else. It's absolutely something else.
When I first heard you say this sentence, orient yourself to the highest possible good you can conceive, I'd never thought of it that way. But when you just lay it out, it sounds really quite logical. Sounds like the most logical thing to do.
Yes.
But I never heard it in an articulated fashion like that.
Yeah.
And I think that many people, I think it was the closing remarks of Maps of Meaning, I think you refer to Pinocchio, when Geppetto, he wishes upon the star, which is the highest
asks
ideal.
for something impossible.
Yeah.
Right.
But can you elaborate on this? Why does the highest possible good constitute meaning? And why do we feel this? Why do we feel when we're doing something meaningful?
Well, I think it's because we go back to the beginning of the conversation, is that we have a problem, right? We have the fall. That's the right way of thinking about it. We have chaos and tyranny, and we have evil. It's like, what do you do about that? You pursue the pathway that solves those problems. That's what the meaningful pathway does. And that's why it feels meaningful. It's like those actually are the problems. See, I've started to think, well, I thought for a long time there are truths of drama and literature, and there are material truths of science. But there are times when those two align, and they're true literally and metaphysically, literally and metaphorically at the same time. Yeah. And the idea that being is a place of tragedy and evil is literally and metaphysically true, and metaphorically true, both at the same time. And the idea that there's a way of dealing with those both at the same time, and that's meaningful, that's also literally and metaphorically true at the same time. Yeah. And the reason for that is that because it's true that our eternal enemies are tragedy and malevolence, we've adapted to them, and we can feel, so to speak, when we're contending with them properly. Yeah. And that feeling of contending with them properly is the feeling of meaning. Yeah. And so there you have it. And the meaning that's produced as a consequence of contending with those properly is the antidote to them at the same time. So, you know, in the Christian story, of course, Christ voluntarily hoists his cross. Okay, so that means a lot of things at the same time. I mean, first of all, it's actually a heavy physical object. Second, it is something you have to hoist up onto your shoulders. It's a genuine burden. So it's a genuine physical burden. But it's also a metaphysical burden, because at the same time that he hoists up his cross, he's accepting the burden of his death. And he's doing that, not only death, but suffering in death. And he's doing that voluntarily. It's like, that's the ticket, exactly that, is to do that voluntarily. It's like, yeah, there's no doubt, life is tragic and bounded by malevolence, no doubt about it. Accept it, accept it, accept it, transcend it. And then you transmute it. That's what I've never recovered from that realization 30 years ago.
Which is a good thing, right?
Right, that's a good thing. But you know, I would say in many ways I'm a deeply pessimistic person, because I'm very aware of the finitude of life and the suffering that's associated with it, acutely aware of that, and also of malevolence. And then I came across this set of ideas, which I've been elaborating, that we've been talking about, and there's this process that's laid out as an antidote. It's like, tell the truth. Orient yourself towards the highest good you can conceive of, and tell the truth, and that will work. And the strange thing is, it works. It's like, really? It works. Those are big problems. You might think they're so big that they have no solution. How could they have a solution? It's like, well, they have a solution. Isn't that something?
I think in one of your lectures you refer to, or you say, or you tell the crowd, and you make these gestures. You talk about alignment a lot, and you always make this gesture. I like that. You say, align your soul with the structure of being. But what does that mean?
Well, it means it's the same thing that you do when you're dancing with someone. So imagine an orchestra is playing.
Are you a good dancer?
I'm a pretty good dancer.
What style?
Well, I wouldn't exactly say that what I have is a style. I can dance with my wife, which is the crucial thing. You know, I mean, I'm good enough dancer so that she likes to dance with me, and she's actually a pretty good dancer, so that works out pretty well. So, and I listen to the music, so I guess maybe that's partly why I can dance, because I actually listen to the music. So imagine there's an orchestra. Okay, now you think about what the orchestra is doing, right? These people are hyper specialized, they're incredibly skilled. They all have their individual talent. They're all pushing the limit when they're really playing well, right? They're pushing the limits of their capability. And then they're organized into groups, strings, horns, etc. So there's the individual, but then there's the group, and then there's the aggregation of the group. And then there's the conductor, who's the king, right? And he's making sure that all of the skillful players play their part harmoniously. And then they're laying out pattern upon pattern upon pattern upon pattern, and they're modeling the structure of reality, because that's what reality is. It's pattern upon pattern upon pattern, all harmoniously, when it's working nicely. It's the music of the spheres. It's all harmony from the lowest subatomic level all the way up to the top, and that's what music is modeling. And then there's society, that's all the dancers, and they're all weaving in and out of each other's territory smoothly and without conflict, because they're paying attention. Yeah. And so that's society dancing to the tune that the king is conducting for the orchestra of being, right? And then there's the dyad, the two people, and they're paying attention to each other and matching their bodies to one another and delighting in the stacked harmony. Well, that's perfect, and people find that extremely enjoyable. It's because they're acting out the proper mode of being. They're dramatizing it. And people find that invigorating and refreshing, and you know, and beautiful, all of those things at the same time. And so that's a dramatized example of how you should live your life. And I mean should, I don't mean you should live your life this way. It's not that. It's that if you want to make things better, not worse, then that's the pathway. That's what I mean by should. It's not follow the rules, God damn it. I mean, there's some of that, because without the rules, we can't coexist, and you can't become disciplined. But it isn't follow the rules.
Your 12 goddamn rules for life.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
No, okay. I understand what you're saying, but it still doesn't quite answer my question. Okay. What does it mean to align your soul with the structure of being? Because this sentence,
yes, okay.
It fascinated me, but I still cannot articulate in a concrete way what it means. It has to do with speaking the truth when facing chaos?
Yeah, because it's partly because, you see, this is something I would really like people to take away from 12 Rules of Life. It's like, there's a chapter in there called Do What Is Meaningful, Not What Is Expedient, and it lays out two pathways and it's so interesting, because I would say that what happened in the Channel 4 interview was that I was trying to use my speech in a meaningful manner, and I'm not saying that I have no lingering elements of expediency, you know. I'm not saying that, but I was trying to utilize my speech in a meaningful manner. I wasn't trying to manipulate the conversation. I didn't have a plan for the interview. Yeah. I didn't think, oh, I'm going to go on here and sell 1 million books. There's no plan. The plan was to go and have a talk. That's it. Yeah. And to let whatever happened happen. Well, so the thing about telling the truth that's so adventurous is that you let go of what you want. And you replace it with a hypothesis. It's the hypothesis of faith. And the hypothesis is, it doesn't matter what I want, because I don't know even what I should want. Instead, I can say what I'm going to make a claim, and a philosophical claim, that if I tell the truth as carefully as I can, then whatever happens is the best that could have possibly happened in that situation, no matter how it looks.
Yeah.
Right, right. And,
That's profound.
well, but it's adventurous. That's the thing that's so fun about it. And I think this is also why it's not merely you should bow down to the rules, because that's sort of a slave mentality in some sense, right? And I mean, you have to be a slave to things. You have to be disciplined. So I'm not denying the utility of following the rules, but telling the truth is much more dynamic than that, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you don't care. Or maybe to put it more precisely, as I said, you assume that whatever happens is the right thing.
Yeah.
And then it was so exciting to me last year when I was doing the biblical lectures to understand finally that the link between the idea of God employing the logos to create habitable order and saying that it was good. I said, oh, okay, so that's the deepest reflection of that idea. The idea is that the being that you speak forth from potential with truth is good.
Yeah.
It's like that might be true.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus, just think what it would be like if that was true.
Yeah.
It's the key. It's like, well, how do you set things right? Tell the truth.
I've actually come to think during the past 2 years that if you honestly speak the truth, it makes you, and well, not indestructible, but it does kind of make your soul indestructible. And I think the archetypes are referred to, Maximus, Hector, Leonidas, all men who spoke the truth. They were all defeated in the end, but their soul was not broken when they were defeated.
Socrates is the best example of that, because we know, the thing about Socrates that's so cool is that, many things, is that, there's arguments about the historical reality of Christ, and there's arguments about the historical reality of the Buddha and Muhammad as well. There's no arguments about the historical reality of Socrates. He lived, and we have 2 transcripts of his trial from 2 different people. Yeah. And they basically, and I outlined this again in the same chapter about doing what is meaningful and not what is expedient. When Socrates, when he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, there was a game that was going on. It was a political game. And Socrates was a gadfly, right? He bothered people because he kept asking them questions, He wanted to know the answers. He'd ask them questions, and then the people he was questioning would find out that they didn't know the answers, and that was very disturbing to them, And so they all got together. Athens was a small city by our standards, only 25,000 people. Everyone knew everyone, like seriously, right? And all the local aristocracy got together and said, God, we're sick of this guy. Why don't we tell him we're going to put him on trial and sort of hint that he should get the hell out of town? That was the game. Yeah. So that, they announced the trial, and everyone knew it was going to be a fixed outcome. But the idea was, well, we'll announce it 6 months ahead of time, and he can have a colloquy with his friends and get out of town, and then we'll be rid of him, and that'll be the end of that. Well, and Socrates knew that this was the game, and so did his friends. And they all got together and said, well, we got to get you out of town. And Socrates was thinking, yeah, that's probably a good idea, because, I don't want to be dead. And then he went off and had a little consultation with his conscience, his daemon, he called it. I think you actually pronounce it demon, but it means conscience for our purposes. And he went and had a conference with it, and he was thinking internally, consulting his conscience, and it said, don't run away. And he thought, well, really? What do you mean don't run away? These people want to kill me. They're going to kill me. What do you mean don't run away? And his conscience said, don't run away. Don't run away. That's how it is. You're not to run away. And Socrates came back and told his friends, okay, I went and talked to my conscience, and he said, the one thing that makes me different from all other men is that when my conscience tells me not to do something, I stop. It doesn't tell me what to do. It tells me what not to do, and then I don't do it, no matter what. That's what made me who I am. And he said, the Delphic Oracle had said, for her part, he said at his trial that he was the wisest man, and she was very highly regarded, right? Whatever she was doing with her hallucinogenic tricks, she was the mouthpiece of the gods, and said that Socrates was the wisest man in Greece. And we still remember him. He didn't run. He didn't run. And then he thought, okay, well, if my conscience is correct, let's assume that for a minute. Weird as that is, because how could it be correct? But it's always been correct before. He said, well, look, and he said this at his trial, I'm old. I'm old. I've been renowned for my clarity of thought. I'm going to die not so long from now. And so now I have this opportunity to put my affairs in order and to say goodbye to everyone and to live the remainder of my life with integrity and to say what I have to say. And then at his trial, he just flips the table and he goes after the people who are prosecuting him. And you see why they want him dead. It's devastating. It's devastating. And so, you know, we know the story 2,500 years later, 3,000 years later. And, well, and that's a reflection of exactly what you said, is that that part of the spirit doesn't die.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean?
I think it means that it dies when you corrupt yourself.
Well, that's what Solzhenitsyn said in the Gulag Archipelago. You know, he said there's something worse than death. That's a good thing to know. Yeah. And that's the death of your soul. And that's whether the soul is immortal or not. It's a psychological idea. It's like there are conditions under which it would be better not to live. Well, that's the cry for freedom, I would say. You know? So, because life without truth is hell. Yeah. That's the right way of looking at it.
Yeah. Strong stuff.
That's for sure. Well, strong stuff.
Yeah, I know.
Life is hard.
I know. And because life is hard, we're going to the fourth point,
okay,
which might make it a little less hard. It's from your biblical series. I think this is from Noah,
yeah,
the flood myth. Make the right sacrifices to walk with God.
Yeah.
And within this conception, the concept of God is a judgmental father, which is an articulation of our discovery of being able to bargain with the future.
Yeah, right.
What does it mean to make the right sacrifices when bargaining with the future?
It means that as you, let's say you conceptualize what you're pursuing as good, and you asked a bit about putting things in alignment, and I would say, okay, well, here's a technical description of what's good. It's what's good for you now, in a way that's good for you tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, so it can be iterated, right? So you can't do impulsive things, because the problem with doing impulsive things is they're really good right now, but you're dead tomorrow. That's not a good solution. And if it's impulsive now and you're dead in a year, that's also not a good solution. So you're bounded by the necessity of preserving yourself across time. But that's not the only boundary, because it has to be good for you, but it also has to be good for the people around you in ever-widening concentric circles. And that's not much different from it being good for your future self. So it's a very constrained set of procedures. Yeah. But people are signaling to each other what these things are all the time. So, you know, if you're in a conversation at a party and you behave properly, then people are happy to have you around and they laugh at your jokes and they tell you interesting things and it's engaging. And if you're off the path at all, then they frown at you or they ignore you or you're boring. And people are signaling your position on the line between chaos and order at you all the time, non-stop. Everyone's broadcasting at everyone else always. And so to align yourself with the highest good is to figure out how to conduct yourself so that all things are working as well as they can because of what you're doing right now. Now, you're aiming at that. That doesn't mean you can do it, but that's what you're aiming at. And then you get better at doing it. And then while you're doing that, in principle, you concentrate on the day, right? So that you can pay real attention to the moment. Orient yourself properly so you're looking in the right direction, you're aiming at the right thing, and then concentrate locally. That's what the Sermon on the Mount, that's the message of the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. So now you have to remind me of
the initial question was, what does it mean to make the right sacrifices?
Right. Okay. So now let's say you're aiming at what you're aiming at. You're walking towards it, right? Well, you may find that there are things that you're doing that you just have to stop doing. And for example, when I was writing Maps of Meaning, I was going out and partying a lot.
3 times a week.
Yeah. When I particularly liked alcohol, and I think it had something to do with my proclivity towards depression. But if I had a couple of drinks, that just disappeared. And I came from a pretty hard drinking childhood culture, you know, where I grew up, and I smoked and as well, and especially when I was drinking, and that was fine. I was pretty immune to hangovers when I was young, but as I got older, that wasn't so much the case. But more than that, when I was working on Maps of Meaning, it was it was really stretching me, like to the limits of my tolerance, and lots of times when I was rewriting and thinking, it was so stressful that if I was hungover, I just couldn't tolerate it. But worse than that, I couldn't think clearly. Not as clearly as I had to.
When you were hungover?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It was like, especially if I had, maybe I'd taken a paragraph and written it 15 times or 20 times trying to get it right. Well, now I had to write it the 21st time, but it was already almost as good as I could make it. And so if I wasn't in tip-top shape when I was looking at it, and I edited it, I'd make it worse. So I had to make a choice. It was like, well, you want to make this better, or do you want to keep going out 3 times a week? Because you can't do both. It's like, okay, well, enough of that. So I stopped doing that. And there's lots of things I stopped doing because they were incommensurate with the goal. And that's a sacrifice, and you make the sacrifices necessary to there's no difference between making sacrifices and transforming. It's the same thing. So you think, well, this is what I want. Okay, well, if that's what you want, then you can't also have this. Make your choice. Okay, I'll give that up. Well, does that please God? Well, that's the archetypal way of thinking about it. Well, you'll find out.
What you also say in your flood myth lectures is that the flood is kind of a metaphor for natural atrophy. Yeah,
so things fall apart.
Things decay. But by making the right sacrifice, you can build the ark to withstand the decay around you.
Well, I really experienced that this year. So in a synchronous way, while I was lecturing about Noah, I was in this intense political controversy. And I mean, I've been in a situation for 15 months now where if I say anything wrong, I'm done. And I've said things that were more wrong than they might have been. It skirted that edge, So I've been hyper vigilant about what I've been saying and what I've been doing for this extended period of time, with real catastrophe lurking as a consequence of making an error. Well, luckily, during that time, especially when it was really intense at the beginning, it's not so threatening now as it was, even though it's still very strange and intense. I was very fortunate because my parents were at my house when all this broke, and my wife and my kids are around. They're adults, and we were sorted out. Like I have a good relationship with my father. We've straightened it out. I have a good relationship with my mom. I trust them both. They tell me the truth. They're on my side. Same with my wife. Same with my kids. And then I have a circle of friends outside that are people. Same thing. Our relationship is solid. We tell each other what we think. And so I had people who were supporting me, helping me figure out when I was making mistakes, telling me when they thought what I was doing was working and when it wasn't. We were analyzing this very carefully. And it was maximally stressful, But there wasn't additional stress because of unresolved issues in the family, And that was good because like 3 or 4 additional pieces of stress, I would have started to make mistakes and the whole bloody thing would have spiraled down.
So let's say that the outside conditions, they were tragedy, but there was no malevolence within your own structure, so you could handle it.
It was restricted to the degree that goodwill had restricted it over about a 25-year period. So you never say none because there's always a snake in the garden, but it was as good as we could make it with our honest attempts to do so. And that was good enough. And then, when I read about Noah, it was a story that I hadn't delved into as deeply as I had into some of the earlier stories in Genesis. There's one line that says that Noah was perfect in his generations. And I thought, I don't know what the hell that means. So I went and looked up, because every biblical phrase, has comments on it from centuries of commentators. So you can really dig into these and figure out what they mean. And basically what it meant was that because he was a good man, he had structured his family in a manner that was healthy, and sustaining. And so then when all hell broke loose, the ark was there and ready. And that's a lesson. It's like you're going to hit things in your life. Like my daughter, for example, was very, very ill, horribly ill for a long time, deathly ill and suffering terribly. She was on high doses of opiates for 2 years. She was basically walking around on 2 broken legs. And that was only one of the things that was bothering her. So she was in agony. It just about broke her at one point. And so we were completely distraught by this ongoing catastrophe, And had there been any additional trouble between my wife and I, or between my daughter and I, or between my son and I, like God only knows what would have happened. Because we barely squeaked through that, but we did get through it. You know, and I told her one thing, for example, which is apropos in this world of victimization. I said, look, kid, she was about 8. I said, you're in real trouble, man. You're in real trouble. It's like, here, you have these terrible physical illnesses. And there's something worse, is that you're going to be tempted to use your illness as an excuse to not engage in life. And it's going to be hard for you to tell when you can't do something because you're sick, and when it would just be convenient of you to use your illness as an excuse for not doing it. I said, look, if you ever do that, you'll not only be sick physically, you'll be sick spiritually, and then you're done. That'll be worse. And to her credit, her great credit, she listened, and she didn't ever play victim. Thank God.
How old was she when you told her this
Oh,
particular
probably
lesson?
8. Yeah, well, the chips were down already. That was she was about that old too, if I remember correctly, when I taught her how to give her own injections, you know, and that was, so she had to use this chemical that was basically...
Painkiller injections?
No, it was an anti-cancer, it was a chemotherapy agent. She didn't have cancer, but it was a chemotherapy agent. And, you know, we could have administered it to her. She had to do it, I think, 3 times a day. And, you know, part of our theory was, well, we want to give her as much control over her fate as possible, you know, and so when she was about 8, I sat her down. She was pretty motivated by money. She's an evil little capitalist, and I sat her down. I said, look, kid, here's your needle. See if you can do this, give your own injection. I said, I'll pay you $50. You sit there and you see if you can do it. If you can do it, I'll give you $50. She sat there, like, on the steps for 45 minutes trying to do it. It's quite harsh to watch.
She was 8 years old at the time?
Yeah, and she did it. And she said, I did it. I said, here's your money, kid. And so the next time she had to do it, I said, it's $50 again, but you only got 15 minutes. So she did it. I paid her, and then as the next, it was like, you got 5 minutes, and then you got 30 seconds, then you got 5 seconds, because, like, what do you want her to sit there and torture herself with the needle for half an hour? It's like, get it over with. And she got so she could do it immediately. And I paid her, I think we paid her $10 for every time she gave herself an injection, pretty much for then on, you know. But, well, you know, there was no choice. She was either going to climb on top of that goddamn illness, or it was going to do her in.
She recovered?
Yeah. Not only did she recover, she figured out what was wrong, and she fixed it. And then she fixed me. So,
how?
Diet changes. Both Tammy and I, my wife, we have autoimmune problems. I mean, hers are of one sort. My wife has celiac disease, and mine are of another sort, which is not quite specified, but seems to be associated with kind of an inflammation-caused depression that runs in my family. But Michaela, my daughter, seemed to get both of them. And it really, well, she developed juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and had her hip destroyed when she was 16, and then her ankle on the other leg the next year. So it was vicious.
But she figured out herself it was a diet issue.
Yep.
Jesus.
That's for sure. And here it's worse than that even, because her dietary response to something that she eats but shouldn't doesn't occur until 4 days after she eats it.
It's hard to track.
Oh, Jesus. And then it lasts a month. So imagine you're trying to figure out your diet. You eat something, you have no idea whether you react to it until 4 days later, so that's virtually impossible to figure out to begin with. And then if you make a mistake, you're screwed for a month. And so that means that, you know, 3 weeks into the month, you might eat something that you don't even know you shouldn't eat, and then it's another month. Yeah. You don't even know. So it's a miracle she figured it out.
It does sound miraculous for her to have articulated order into this chaotic mode.
Yeah, it is. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's really, she was sleeping 18 hours a day. She could only stay awake using Ritalin. Like, she was seriously depressed, like terribly depressed. Yeah. And that was actually, I asked her at one point, the depression was partly associated with pain, but not only that, I asked her at one point, and this is something to think about in regard to depression. I asked her one day when she was about 13, I said, look, kid, no, it was after her ankle had fallen apart on her and she'd undergone all this pain. She had 38 affected joints, and the prognosis was multiple early joint replacement, so we found that out when she was quite young. But I asked her one day, okay, you got a choice, kid. You can either have the arthritis or the depression. Which would you pick? She said she'd pick the arthritis. So that gives you some indication of what the depression was like.
Quite severe.
Yeah, I would say so. It's a form of agony that you wouldn't wish upon your worst enemy. And it looks like it was inflammation.
And this at that age, so young.
Yeah. Anyway, she's not taking any medication.
No.
Great. No. It's amazing.
It's a miracle.
And she had a baby this year, so
I saw.
we were never sure that was going to happen.
Yeah.
So that was, we squeaked through, man.
Yeah.
So
by having a relation that was embedded in
well,
truth.
that was at least we didn't interfere with whatever was within her that might have been able to manage this, right?
Yeah.
So there wasn't. So her brother, you know, and more power to him. I always treated him, Julian is his name, ever since he was a little kid. I treated him like he was what would you say? Capable of wisdom. And when he was little, I used to ask him, you know, hard questions, and ask him about how we should structure things in the household, ask him about how chores should be distributed, bring him into the conversation. And he was always very judicious, very diplomatic, and very mature. And right from the time he was a little kid, I never played any games with him. And any tricks on him, you know. Well, never. I did my best not to. And, you know, when he was about 14, which is sort of prime troublemaking time, and he certainly had the temperament for it, he was a bloody rock, you know. He was perfect. He helped his sister. He stayed around the house. He didn't cause any extra trouble, or if he did, he kept it private and didn't involve us in it. And he accepted the fact that we didn't have as much time to pay attention to him as we would have liked to. And he let his sister rely on him. And he didn't go out with his friends as much as he might have, and he did that for multiple years. No complaints. Perfect. So, thank God for that.
Yeah. Thank God indeed. We have one more point to address if you want. It's actually the fifth point.
Mm-hmm.
It says minimize your persona, cultivate your essence, and live in its closest possible proximity, referring to the essence. I think there's one lecture of you on existentialism and authenticity, and this is a theme throughout Maps of Meaning, especially the Pinocchio series. Could you elaborate on that? What is a persona? What is an essence?
Persona is like a suit of, it's like a suit. I mean, a business suit. A business suit is the expression of a persona. So when you go into a bank and you see the teller and the teller's in a suit, you really interact with the suit in some sense. Yeah. Because you don't want to hear about the tragedy of the teller's life. It's not the time or place for that. And he doesn't want to hear about yours. You want to walk in there in a suit and you want to see him or her in business attire, and you want to do your financial transaction. You want to say hello and be polite, and you want to leave. Yeah. And so what that means is that you have to have a public face for your complexity. Yeah. And you have to simplify yourself so that other people can interact with you. It's politeness, right? It's politeness to do that, and it's politeness not to poke behind that unless people ask. Yeah. And then it's part of being civilized, domesticated even. That's the downside. That's the side that subjects you to tyranny, but it's part of being civilized. So you go from the state of nature to possession by the persona, let's say. But that's not where it should stop, because then if you're only persona, that's not good, because you're too tightly associated with the state and the culture. There's nothing about you that's really individual. There's no, the spirit, your individual spirit hasn't been integrated into your personality. So you have to go beyond the persona. It doesn't mean you don't have to have one. God, you're no good at all if you don't have a persona. Who can stand being around you? You don't know how to behave. But if you only know how to behave, you're just a domesticated house cat or a lap dog. Yeah. You have to push beyond the persona, and that's what the integration of the shadow does from the Jungian perspective. It's like to pull that monster that's been edited out of you, to pull that back in and to allow that to reveal itself within your increasingly sophisticated way of being. And then you're not just a persona.
So if you want to push back on your persona, are you saying that you have to cultivate your shadow? Is that the premier path?
Yeah, because the thing is, you can't escape from your persona unless you can say no. Here's an example from popular culture. In the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter's obviously the hero of the story, But he's touched by malevolence, right? The only reason he can stand up against evil is because there's some evil in him that he's incorporated, essentially. Well, and that's exactly right. And that the persona, if you're a persona, then you're an obedient citizen. But the problem with being an obedient citizen is that if the society tells you to march the Jews off to the death camp, for example, and you're obedient, then that's what you'll do. And it isn't like society is civilized and then all of a sudden you're performing some act of atrocity. That isn't how it works. It's like you're obedient citizen and then you're asked to violate your conscience a little bit.
Yeah.
And you have to, because you don't have anything other than that persona. And that's obedience. And so a little more obedience is demanded and you say, okay, well then you're a little bent, because the society is becoming a little bent, and then you're a little weaker. Then you're asked to violate your conscience a little bit more, and you think, well, there's a little less of me, and the pressure's on a little more, and I could have said no before, but I didn't. So you say yes again, then you say yes again, and then you have a society where 1/3 of the population is informing on the other 2/3. Yeah. It's hell. It's like, well, so how do you say no? Well, that's the shadow. It's like, and see, the reason that the video I did about Bill C-16 and its compelled speech provisions went viral was because I said no. I didn't say it casually. What I meant was, there isn't anything that you can do to me that I can imagine that will force me to utter the words that you want me to utter. Nothing. And I meant it. And when I made the video, I think people could actually tell that I meant it. And so I took this abstract problem and made it concrete. I said, no, that's not happening. And that's part of the incorporation of the shadow.
But in this regard, the shadow is actually benevolent, not malevolent.
Well, once it's incorporated, yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah. And I don't know what to make of that in its entirety, because it sort of means that it means something like, because one of the old metaphysical problems is, why would God allow evil into the world? I think, well, maybe God didn't allow evil into the world. Maybe God allowed the possibility of evil into the world. That's different. And maybe the world with the possibility of evil is actually a better world than the world without the possibility of evil. It's something like that, in that maybe a man is better when he's a dangerous man who's being good than he would be if he was just a good man who wasn't capable of being dangerous. And I believe that, because the best men that I've ever met are very dangerous men. Yeah. You don't mess with them. Yeah. So, and you know that as soon as you meet them.
Do you think weak men can be virtuous?
No.
Because I think that when you're weak, let's say that signals that you don't have the options to sin.
Right.
Which is something that creates resentment, and resentment creates corruption. Mm-hmm. So in this sequence, do you think that someone without teeth or without the options to sin can be
good? See, that's a real theological question, right? Because the question you're asking is, and this is tied up with the idea of free will and evil. Can a person who doesn't have the option to be evil be good? And I would say no. So maybe that's the reason that, metaphysically speaking, and I don't know where you are when you're speaking metaphysically exactly, but the question of why is there evil in the world is a constant question. It's like, it's possible that without the possibility of evil, there cannot be good. Good requires the possibility of evil. And maybe good is so good that the fact that it requires the possibility of evil is acceptable. Maybe it's even desirable. I mean, you kind of end up on the edge of your knowledge when talking about such things. But it seems to me to be right. Yeah. And it seems to be right in a lived sense. I met Jocko Willink. He's a good example. I mean, Willink was the commander in Ramada, I think. And you can say what you want about American military involvement. It has nothing to do with that, really. Not at this level of analysis. He's a tough guy.
I follow him on Twitter.
Yeah, so
He gets up every morning at 5:30, 4:30.
He's a tough guy. He told me quite straightforwardly that he was one of those kids that as an adolescent could have gone either way, right? Yeah. He could have been a highly successful street criminal.
Yeah, probably.
Right, but probably. Well, you can see it. But he decided not to do that. And he's very, I would say
he was a SEAL, right?
Mm-hmm, that's right. And he's psychophysiologically intimidating. He's a big guy. You can tell he knows how to use it, and you can tell he used it. Yeah. But as far as I can tell, he's a good person. And that's actually, all of that capacity for mayhem is part of what makes him a good person.
Yeah.
And people know that. That's why they're listening to him.
Yeah.
And like I said, the other people I've met the men I've met who are good men, they're all like that. They're all dangerous. They're all dangerous.
Yeah. Have they all been not good men before? Or is that not part of becoming a good man?
I would say they've certainly all done things that well, you know, adolescents break rules, right? And healthy adolescents break rules. And so then the question is, well, how extreme does the rule breaking become? Well, it would vary from person to person, but I would say that most of them, not all of them, but most of them were more on the end of the rule breaking spectrum, right? They broke more rules than normal, but they clued in, you know, and explored that and then decided, no, that's better than cowardice.
Yeah.
It's better than weakness, but it's not as good as what's good.
Yeah. So if we follow this doctrine, actually the people that are accusing you of instantiating like toxic masculinity, well, let's say that it's true that you're promoting male strength. Mm-hmm. If you follow
masculine
this
strength.
Yeah,
it's important because I'm also promoting it in women.
Yeah.
You know, like my daughter's a good example, man. She's tough. You don't mess with her. She'll cut you apart.
Yeah, I believe you. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was wrongly phrased.
No, it's okay.
No, but the thing, what I'm trying to get is that when you're telling people to empower themselves.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that because I'd never use that word.
Empower?
I hate that word, well, but it's okay.
To become
I'm
stronger.
Encouraging people.
Yeah.
I like that word better because I'm encouraging people.
Yeah.
You know, to put courage into them. That's better.
Yeah. So by becoming courageous, you increase your potential for being virtuous. Mm-hmm. That's basically...
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I one of the most amazing things that I discovered this year, or stumbled upon, was I was puzzling over a line in the New Testament, which I've always been curious about because it never sat right with me. The meek shall inherit the earth. And so I was, as I said before, if you go online, Bible Hub, I think it's called, Bible Hub. It's really good for this because it contains a collection of commentaries, so you can look at a verse. And, right? You can look at a verse and on the translations, multiple translations, and multiple commentators. So each verse is taken apart by many, many people. And I found out that the word meek either doesn't mean now what it meant when people first translated the text, or it was a mistranslation, either way. But because meek sounds like powerless and harmless, it's something like that, right? But what meek actually means, it's the derivation of a word, it's the translation of a word that meant something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed. I thought, oh yes, that's exactly it. The world, those who have swords and know how to use them but choose to keep them sheathed will inherit the world. It's like, yes, exactly right, exactly right. Much different than the idea of
quite
meek.
Different, quite different. I think this is a good point and a good note to close this off.
I agree.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Nice talking with you.
Same.